and you enjoy following along with the reading, please turn in your less recent testament, Nehemiah chapter 4. This is where we're going to be spending our time today. The funny thing about, well, it's not funny really, it's interesting to me, about Christianity is that most people who don't believe, I would say of the people with whom I correspond about Christianity who are atheists, 99% of them, I'd say that's very accurate, have a caricature of what Christianity actually is, and that's what they're responding to. They don't respond to Christianity as it really is. They respond to the caricature, and they tear at that straw man caricature and then feel as though they've somehow come to a good conclusion. That's a real problem when you think about it, because it makes our job all the more difficult. There was a time in the West when you didn't really have to explain Christianity in such a way as to defeat what would be called straw men, which I'll elaborate on in a minute. But now we do, because that's the dominant understanding of what it is to be a follower of Jesus. It's a caricature. So with that in mind, let's take a look at this text in Nehemiah chapter 4. I'll read it and then I'll summarize the history. I'll begin reading in verse 13. Nehemiah says, I stationed people at the lower places behind the wall in the exposed places, and I stationed people by families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. When I had made an inspection, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of those who oppose us. Remember the great and awesome Lord, and fight on behalf of your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your families. So it happened that when our adversaries heard that we were aware of their plot, God frustrated their intentions. Then all of us returned to the wall, each one to their own work. From that day forward, half the people were doing the work, and half of them were taking up spears, shields, bows, and body armor. Now, the officers were behind all of the people of Judah who were rebuilding the wall. Those who were carrying loads did so by keeping one hand on their work and the other on their weapon. The builders, to a person, had their swords strapped to their sides while they worked, but the trumpeter remained with me. And I said to the officials, the nobles, and the rest of the people, the work is demanding and extensive, and we're spread out along the wall, far removed from one another. However, whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, gather there with us, and our God will fight with us. So we worked on, half holding spears until dawn, from dawn till dusk. Now, there's a lot of history here, and I think it would be remiss to not look at the history here. Who is Nehemiah? Well, Nehemiah is a prophet, but he's also the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, the Persian king. Now, that's a really interesting job, because a cupbearer is like a fuse in the fuse box. Really, that's what they are. If there's a problem electrically in the house, the fuse burns out and you go get another one. If there's a problem with the king's food or drink, the cupbearer is the one who finds out, and the cupbearer is replaced by another cupbearer. In other words, he would taste everything the king would have to eat and drink before the king ate it or drank it. And they would do this long before the king ate and drank, and then they'd wait to see if the cupbearer dies. If the cupbearer dies, then obviously somebody's trying to poison the king, so we go get another cupbearer. That was the job. This job brought Nehemiah into close personal proximity with King Artaxerxes 7 days a week. And his station is completely dispensable. The king, did you know this? In the ancient Near East, you may probably all aware of this. In the ancient Near East, in nearly every kingdom situation, you were not allowed, if you were called into the king's court, you were not allowed to even look at the king. You could not look at them on the throne at all unless they invited you to do so. Everything that you did when you were brought into the king's court in the ancient Near East was done only by request of the king. Nothing. You couldn't come in there and complain about anything. You couldn't come in there and talk about anything. If there were sporting events that everybody was interested in, you couldn't even come in there and talk to the king about that unless you were invited. And then the king had to hold out the scepter, which allowed you then to speak. You couldn't speak. Now think about Nehemiah. He's in that position. He has to bring the food after he tastes it up to the king. He can't look at the king because Nehemiah is nothing more than a fuse in the fuse box. That's all he is. Now, there's something to also be kept in mind here regarding the Persians. The Persians who conquered the Babylonians. Remember the Babylonians, they deported Jews to Babylon, and then they imported their people back to the places where the Jews had left. Their means of conquest was very different from the Persians. The Persians, the only way you can look at the Persian conquest is to look at it like the United States of America. The Judah and Israel were a vassal of the Persian government because of conquest. But they were completely independent. They could do whatever they wanted. The Persians didn't care about your culture. They didn't care about your religion. They didn't care about how you farmed. They didn't care about anything. All you had to do was pay the tax. That's all you had to do. And you were free to be whoever you were. So, but if somebody attacked Israel and Judah, the Persians would send the Persian army in, just like in the United States. If Cuba, say for instance, were to attack Florida, let's say that Cuba invites a bunch of Chinese troops to Florida, and there's an attack. The federal government would send the army to protect Florida. Florida's not on its own. They have the protection of the federal government. It was the same in Persia. Persia they were a wise kingdom in terms of the way they operated their vassal states. They left them alone. If you paid your taxes, you were in. And so Nehemiah comes into the king's court day after day after day, and King Artaxerxes takes note of the fact that Nehemiah seems downcast. What's the matter with Nehemiah? Well, you'll notice there's no place in there where Nehemiah just spouts off. He waits for the king to ask him, why are you downcast? Then Nehemiah now has permission to tell the king what's going on. He's downcast because the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and destroyed the temple walls. And Nehemiah wants to go back and rebuild them. He's sad for his land. Now, for me as a Westerner, I have no sympathy with that. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just don't feel it. I've got a 5/8 of an acre yard with a house sitting on it. That's my land. Well, it doesn't appeal to me in that sense of anything in terms of my connection to the soil. But in this era, these people were. Land was everything. It still is. To the Jewish nation, land is everything. That has not changed one bit. And so he does feel this. And Nehemiah wants to go back and rebuild. Well, when the king asks him what's wrong and Nehemiah spills the beans regarding what's causing him to be downcast, he gets the shock of his life. Artaxerxes not only says, well, I'm going to send you back. And not only that, I'm going to help you with the finances. And not only that, I'm going to give you protection from the army. Think of that. Nehemiah, who could not say anything till asked, has said this to this Persian king, and now the Persian king, like Paul says, God will do exceedingly beyond what we hope or pray or expect. That's exactly what's happened to Nehemiah. God has done exceedingly beyond what Nehemiah expected. Nehemiah was just hoping not to die as he was standing in the king's presence. So he kind of takes that risk and just goes for it. Well, so it begins. And that brings us to where we are now. They've gone there. They've taken all kinds of material and they're building the walls, but they're being opposed. They're being opposed by other Semites, other Semitic groups of people. You'll notice one of them is the Ammonites. Very significant group of people. They're the descendants of Lot with an incestuous relationship with his youngest daughter, producing children. They named the child, the product of that incestuous relationship, Ammon, which means inbred. How would you like to be a member of the people group called the inbredites? It's not a very complimentary group of people to be named in my view, but that's who they were. And they opposed the Jews. This is where two things. The first is supernatural, that King Artaxerxes was so moved to do what he did. That's supernatural. I don't care what anybody says. The fact that Nehemiah is the cupbearer is supernatural. The fact that Nehemiah gets the opportunity to relate his downcast condition to the king and why it's there is supernatural. And the king's response is supernatural. The fact that the Persians, being the conquerors at this time in history of the Babylonians, is supernatural. All of it. Because look at what it produces. But there's another supernatural element here as well. And that is, there's opposition. That's supernatural also. Why do these Arabs care what the Jews are doing? Why do they care today what they're doing? Well, because they feel as though the land is theirs, not the Jews. The Jews are usurpers in their minds. And so what do? Remember, I started out talking about a straw man. They erect a straw man regarding what Israel is doing. They say they're plotting a rebellion. They're building the wall so that they can rebel. That's not what they're doing. Artaxerxes knows that's not what they're doing, but this is the means by which they're going to attack the Jews and thwart what they're doing. They erect a straw man and then say the straw man is what the Jews are actually about. Why? This is people who oppose the gospel, people who oppose God, people who oppose the Jews. I promise you this, 95% of the time they have no idea why. They don't know why they're so opposed to it. Why? I mean, the same people that I argue with have all the, I won today a long paragraph about how we should love and give and be happy and everybody live and let live and just be at peace with one another, and yet at the same time talk about Christianity as though it's some kind of total fantasy. You're believing a fantasy and then oppose it. Why? What's the purpose? It's supernatural. This is not something that's just happening because people look at Christianity and think I need to save these poor Christians from what they're suffering from at all. Nor is it the state of affairs with the Jews here that the Arabs feel like they've got to save the Jews from what they're suffering with. The Arabs in this case are all polytheists. Yahweh, the God of the Jews, is just another one on the list. And so they don't think there's any reality to it because, you know why? Because they know the ones they worship don't have any reality either. We build a statue and fall down in front of it. It's a block of wood or a piece of stone or a piece of metal. There's nothing there. And we think Yahweh is just the same as that. Why do you think God insisted that the Jews have no image of him anywhere? There's a really good reason for that. Because he has none. The God of the universe has no image. So, they don't accept the Jews. They don't believe the God that the Jews are following is real. And it's so fascinating. If you move this forward 500 years into the New Testament era, you've got the same thing going on. Jesus stands in front of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and the Herodians, all of the Jewish intelligentsia of his day. They don't believe anything about God anymore. Most of them just like the gig. The Sadducees were fabulously wealthy, as were the Pharisees for the most part, as were the scribes, as were the Herodians. Why? They collected temple tax. And so we've passed all these laws where everybody's got to be so careful, stuff that's not in the Bible at all. And we hold people responsible for it. Why? 600 years now, God has no longer dwelt in the temple. Go back and read Ezekiel. God left the temple during the time of Ezekiel, never to return until he restores everything. The temple's just a building now in Jesus' time. So who is Jesus when he says to us, to everybody, to the people listening there that day, if you're going to be a follower of mine, you've got to take up your cross every day. You've got to hate your family. You've got to count the cost and give up everything. Well, they didn't like that any more than we like it today. They didn't like that phrase. I mean, think about it. The Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and Herodians would say, so what? Right? This guy's not representing God. Why should we pay any attention to him? For them, the reality of the Messiah was Jesus is not the guy. That's what they believed. And why would they want to be a follower of Jesus? Why would they want to be a disciple as Jesus described it? I wouldn't. I mean, if somebody just came up from nowhere and started saying this is what it takes to be my disciple, I'd say, well, I don't want to be one of yours. That's crazy. Why would I want to do that? But it's because there's a complete ignorance of the supernatural component here. That's why the Pharisees, scribes, Herodians, and Sadducees responded as they did. God was no longer speaking to them. So, counting the cost. Jesus gave 3 terms for discipleship, and this falls directly in line with Nehemiah. The 3 terms are, you got to hate your immediate family. Now, I love, this is one of those caricatures, I get it all the time. How could you worship a God who tells you you've got to hate your family? He doesn't mean that I'm supposed to not like my mom and dad. What he means is, if you're going to be my follower, there are going to be times when you're going to have to choose between following me and what your parents think is right. If your parents don't believe, why should you expect that they'd be glad? I remember, and I say this with reverence, there was a time in my life when I first became a believer where my mom thought I was joining a cult. And she was sincere about it. She was worried. I mean, she thought the way I'm talking, the kinds of things I'm saying, I was brand new born again, and it was all very fresh for me and very real, and I'm talking about all this like it's real. My mom's not a believer, and she thought I was joining a cult. I was being opposed by my family to a degree. That's what he means. And then he says, carry a cross. What does that mean? God may give you or me some kind of entrustment that we have to carry. It may not be something we really want to carry, but I promise you this, if we're truly followers of Jesus and the Spirit of God lives in us, we'll be glad to carry it. It'll be fulfilling to carry it. And then he says, count the cost and give up everything. This means I should look at Jesus with my eyes wide open and make a decision, just like Nehemiah made a decision that day. His eyes are wide open. He's standing in the king's court. He knows he could be killed. And it would be totally just in that culture. Artaxerxes says, this guy's looking at me. Out with him. That'd be the end of it. Or, of course, he eats the bread and kills him. And we just get another cupbearer. The passage that Jesus gives here is a fearsome one. But it's no more fearsome than that which Nehemiah seems to have taken on board on his own as a follower of God. The idea here is one that separates being a follower of God, or Jesus, however you want to describe that today, from a cause, just a cause. I mean, all of us in this room, we all think about various things that are important to us, say socially or politically, and those become causes to us. Maybe liberty, maybe gun rights, maybe civil rights, whatever it is. And I'm not saying those things are bad, nor am I saying they can't be totally concomitant with being a follower of Jesus. They might be. Take abortion, for instance. You know, if a person opposes abortion and gives part of their resources to oppose it, I'd say that is being totally a follower of Jesus in that way. But it's different than a cause. That's different. I mean, I can adopt a cause, health. There's one. I've adopted that for myself as best as I can. So I do what I can to maintain reasonable weight and health. I do. It's a cause. Whether God has inspired me to do it or not is a whole different question. That could be ended if God called me to do something that made it impossible for me to pursue that cause, which could happen, right? What if I'm imprisoned for my faith? I'm not going to be able to run every day. Just not going to happen. So think about it this way. What happens is if we look at, and I say this with reverence, I think a lot of people who are in churches look at Christianity as a cause. The Spirit of God does not live in some that are in our churches. And so for them, it's, think about how many times you've had somebody say, I've had this said to me right here in Maynard, I'm in church because my mom and dad were in church. I learned it from them. It's not because the Spirit of God lives in me and I wouldn't want to not be in church in a congregational setting. It's because my mom and dad were in church. I'm not saying that's bad. That's good. At least you're here. But it becomes a cause, not the Spirit of God filling somebody up and causing them to do things like that. And church becomes a great place to feel good in some ways. I feel good being in a congregational setting. I hope everybody else does too. I like seeing you all. I like having our conversations. I like having cookies and coffee together. I like laughing and talking about what went on in the week. But what can happen so easily is that we then split things off. And following Jesus becomes that which we're doing in here, and what we do out there is something altogether different. That's not what Nehemiah gives us as an example here at all, nor does Jesus. Remember when they went up on the mountain of transfiguration? Peter, James, and John go up there, Jesus is up there, and Elijah and Moses show up. Wow. I mean, you got to be impressed with that if you're there. And they are. They're so impressed, they say, let's just stay here. Let's build tents for everybody, and we'll just stay here. And of course, they can't stay there. They've got to come down off the mountain, and immediately they're thrust back into the messy, difficult world that they left when they were up there seeing the spectacular things they saw. It's always my disappointment with a vacation. I know there's going to be a last day. You know, I'm going to have to pack everything up and move out of the room we're in and move back to the house we came from. There's no avoiding that, right? But we bifurcate and we think to ourselves, this is what feels good, so this is where I want to stay. And when I get out there, it's a whole different category of life, having nothing to do with what I say I am as a follower of Jesus. And it's easy to do. I'm not trying to accuse any of us in this room of this. I'm just saying it's something we need to be aware of because it is so easy to do. So easy. And then you've got the other side of it, where sometimes because of the way that congregational life is structured, people become so heavenly minded you can't even talk to them. You know, I had a friend of mine in New Jersey. This was years and years and years ago. Everything was praise the Lord. I'm thinking, I appreciate what you're doing here, but this isn't to think about this in a real way. It became a kind of a mantra that was just being spouted because that was the kind of church life that they had. Everything was praise the Lord, no matter what it was. There was not even a moment's reflection as to what this really might mean for those people who might be suffering in some way. So we can become so heavenly minded we're not any good to anybody here. That can happen too. But let me just put it this way. If the congregational setting becomes that which is nothing more than something to make us feel good, then it's very easy to see people fall away from that. Very, very easy. All it takes is a little trouble. And if we're separating the two things out there, what God might be saying to us doesn't really carry any water. The only thing where God is operating is he's operating in here. He's not operating out there because we've separated the two things out. Look at Nehemiah. What did he tell the people to do? You got a trowel in one hand and you got a spear in the other. That's all of life. It's all one thing. It's not two things. It's one thing. This thing that Jesus says to us regarding he says it in the negative. You cannot be my disciple unless you do these three things. It's a hard word to you and me in here. If a person is merely a spectator, it's offensive. That's why it offended the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and the Herodians in the day it was spoken. Nehemiah captured the fact that when a person is truly a follower of God, there's no separation between the mundane and the spiritual. No separation between the mundane and the sacred. It's all one thing. All one thing. That's where the me gospel comes up short. Because all it tells me is what God's going to do for me. Being a follower of Jesus, what's that going to do for me? It never, ever tells me what it might cost me to be a follower of Jesus. And like Ed says about this issue all the time, just take a look at the disciples and how they lived and how they died. There weren't any disciples with fancy dwellings and lots of property. Jesus knows, God knows, just like in Nehemiah's time and just like in our time, that we've got to come down off the mountain and get into this messy world. He knows that. He wasn't telling everybody, he's not telling us today, that everybody in this room's just got to become a foreign missionary or you're no good for the gospel at all. He's not saying that. There's no category here. When we say yes to Jesus, why do you think Paul says to us, and this is a good thing, not a hard thing, He says, bring yourselves to God, put yourselves on the altar as a living sacrifice. This is your acceptable worship. And we talk about worship singing. Looks to me like that's just one category of a life that becomes worship in some manner. I know yesterday in my home, I was not worshiping. I'll just tell you that. Leave it at that. And when we live like that, when we separate this from that, people look at us and they say, well, you just look like everybody else. And they're absolutely correct. They're absolutely correct. If my life as a follower of Jesus costs me nothing out there, then I just look like everybody else. How's anybody going to know? Yeah, my car's in the parking lot here, but so what? If church, think of it like this, and you just think about this in your own mind if you agree with this or not. If church becomes the only place of expression in that we're followers of God, I'm going to say to answer that, the devil is very clever. Very clever. God is the one that does the calling. So he may take a person, and look at Nehemiah. What did God call Nehemiah to do? Be a cupbearer. That was his gig. And you're to be the best cupbearer you can be for the sake of my name in the earth. And that's what he did. And then God used him and used a pagan king to restore the walls of Jerusalem. That's amazing to me. But it shows that when a person's whole life is subsumed in, I'm a follower of Jesus, that God can do amazing things with people when they're like that. Amazing things. In the tiniest of areas. The tiniest of areas. Or maybe a big area. So there's a real peace in expressing our discipleship with God in the areas that we think don't really matter that much, like in a marriage or in our business or in our relationships with our children or friends. All of those areas. How we use our money. All of it. And only God can make us disciples. That's nice in my view. If I have to do it myself, I'm in a lot of trouble. But God's going to change what I want to do, what I want to be. There's a lot of richness in living life as a kind of sacred journey. Nehemiah did, and look at what God did. Are we ready as Nehemiah was ready to live in the simple, goofy, nothing places of our lives and to live those as part of a sacred journey for God's namesake in the earth? I guarantee you, if we live like that, people will see it. And it won't be just in here. And then with a trowel in one hand and a sword and a spear in the other, ready to engage the battle for this fallen world. Man, that just sounds interesting to me. It sounds like something I'd want to be involved in, not just what's on TV tonight. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question,